They're doing all the work and how we can move forward from there. Put your hands together. Welcome Kevin Lynn.
It's interesting. When Ray said a bright future, I said, do you really want me up here? Because I am the most pessimistic optimist that I know. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's great to see that the entrepreneurial spirit is alive and well in the California Democratic Party. I was a member of the CADM on the executive board myself for a couple of years, so it's a great privilege to be back here with everyone. Being here with the Caucus, I'm reminded of a radio interview I heard number of years ago, and the person being interviewed was the late great mythologist Joseph Campbell. And the interviewer asked him, are entrepreneurs heroes? And he stated unequivocally, yes. And the reason for this is the entrepreneur goes to work every day for risk, and the rest of us go to work for security. And so, yes, you are heroic, and you should be applauded for what you do every day. So, I'm going to talk about a lot of bad things, and then I'm going to talk about how to fix them. But before I begin, get into the crux of my speech, I'd like to have a couple narratives or movies running in the back of your minds before I get into it. And question for everyone, how many of you remember like typing on a Smith Corona chronomatic typewriter, IBM Selectric? Oh, yes. Right, yeah. Right. Yeah, 1979, 1980, 1982, 1983, we're typing away, throwing in our cassettes and everything. Yep. And then WordStar came out. WordStar, oh my God, a word processor. Oh my gosh, this is amazing. No more whiteout, no more whiteout cassette thing. This is amazing. Now, that period of time, between the late 70s and 1980s, an interesting thing was going on, and I'll read this. According to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, non-farm payroll employment increased from 89.8 million in 1979 to 108.3 million in 1989, an increase of 18.5 million jobs. Also, women and young persons were moving or accessing into jobs at a higher rate than older men. Also, labor force participation from 1979 to 1989 went from 63.9 to 66.5%. And that upward trend went on right up until it peaked in 2000, and it has been going downward ever since. And IT, AI, all of these things factor into that. So, the other narrative is, and so, the Honorable Councilwoman mentioned it earlier, we went from an agrarian to an industrial revolution. We had a couple of those revolutions, in fact. One started in 1870 to about 1914, and the other one from the early 2000s up until, the 1950s. And the second one, it was heralded in by people like Henry Ford that brought us mass production. And also the realization that if your employees are not making a livable wage, they cannot afford to buy your product. And that is death in a world of mass commoditization, mass production. So that's the second narrative I'd like spinning in your heads while I'm talking. And the third one, a friend of mine said this a couple weeks ago, and her name is Yvette Carnell, and she has a very popular YouTube show called Breaking Ground. And she said something, when you're looking to diagnose an issue with a plant, you have to look at the soil. So think about all that as I'm talking, because my thesis statement tonight is that right now, AI, information technology, is enhancing productivity. You look at the Dow Jones Industrials, their equity prices are through the roof. NASDAQ, the same thing. Corporate profits are amazingly high, benefiting from things like near zero interest rates. I mean, they're doing stock buybacks and basically feathering their own nests. And at the same time, workers in America are more stressed. We're finding it harder and harder to get by. And I believe a lot of this has to deal with the offshoring of our jobs and data and jobs around data, and the displacement of American tech workers through the abuse of employment visa programs like H-1B, OPT, L-1, and others. And there are consequences for this. You know, imagine, if you will, turn that around, Hillary Gamm, who wrote a book, Billions Lost. Now, I know Hillary very well. Hillary Gamm is a pseudonym. She's a 20-year tech working veteran, and this year she published her book, Billions Lost, that details what's going on with tech workers in this country. And she says something, and this deals with things more in general. We'll get in more detail with tech workers soon. In her book, Billions Lost, less than half our nation's population is now considered middle class. According to the Pew Research Center, 49.9% of Americans, down from 61% in 1971, are middle class. In the 1960s, 28% of American workers were employed in manufacturing. That is down to 8.7% today. According to Edward Leamer, an economist, and that's according to Edward Leamer, he's a professor of economics at University of California. So, data is the new oil, and tech work, information technology, there are very few barriers to entry to having these jobs move offshore or data move offshore. And Hillary described it as, you know, you realize a rapid change, low barriers to entry, and portability have made tech work the easiest industry in our country's history to outsource. The result is trillions of dollars in lost opportunity to the US economy. Now, since the 1990s, we have been offshoring our data and amping up the number of expats holding jobs here in the US. And this isn't a strange coincidence. It actually, in 2000, an 8-year class action lawsuit against Microsoft ended with $97 million being awarded to contractors. And essentially, Microsoft was found guilty of denying employment benefits to these contractors, and they should have. Well, they paid their money, but they also said, we're never going to enter into these one-on-one agreements with contractors again. They began to use large outsourcing companies like Infosys, Tata, a firm that I used to work for, Ernst & Young, Capgemini, Accenture. And what they would do is enter into a relationship with these companies. And it created a downward pressure on wages in the information technology sector, also job security. In the 1980s and 1990s, ladies and gentlemen, being a tech worker was a phenomenal job. You actually kind of wanted to be a contractor because there was always work, it paid well. All you had to do was keep your skills up and going, and that wasn't that hard. So, to understand why Americans are fearful of artificial intelligence, as ample examples were given earlier with AI, robotization, things like that, you can see why people are uneasy about this. And I think there's something that we can do to stop that, or actually go back to that one movie I have running in your heads where, yes, you know, in the 80s, we adopted better information technology, but it led to a net increase in jobs. I'm sure the folks at Smith Corona, they sold off their typewriter plant, but things were elastic and we were able to find employment in other industries. So what's going on? Why are we seeing this downward pressure on wages in the tech economy? Why is it? When I founded US Tech Workers, I was absolutely stunned by the number of qualified Americans that were not gainfully employed. And this is the norm anymore. And here are some of the numbers. US citizens make up only 29% of the Silicon Valley workforce. Indian expats working in the US hold 12% of the IT jobs on these shores. This is not counting the number of jobs foreign workers hold for US flag corporations abroad, and I'll get into some of those numbers later. I was reading an article by Carolyn Peterson of Al Jazeera, where she reported on a Pew poll that demonstrated that despite the national focus on recruiting more women and people of color to STEM professions, the fields remain a relatively inhospitable place for these workers. The study suggests women's representation in computer jobs has actually declined since 1990. Pew said blacks and Hispanics continue to be underrepresented in STEM occupations, making up 9% and 7% of STEM workers, respectively. Employment visas issued to India grew from 44% of all our employment visas in 2005 to 71% in 2015. Now, some of our nation's largest tech companies like Adobe Systems, Amazon, AT&T, Apple, Cisco, Dell, Google, IBM, Intel, Intuit, Lucent, Yahoo, and many more all have a presence in India and employ workforces for thousands of people in their overseas offices. My background is I worked for one of the large accounting firms, and at a tax conference, I sat through a lecture with a woman from Deloitte & Touche, and she had just gotten back from 3 months in Hyderabad, India, where they brought on about 40 workers. And what they were going to do was outsource preparation of business personal property tax returns. So, like a company, they will, if they're in multiple states, multiple jurisdictions, they'll have an accounting firm kind of fill out all these personal property tax returns. That way they stay within the laws and pay their taxes. Well, this was going to be outsourced to India. And after they'd worked the glitches, they found it was working pretty well. And my problem with that was this. When someone leaves college with an accounting degree and they go into tax, the first thing they're given is the return to do. And they'll spend several years doing that return. They will, for instance, they'll learn the taxability in various jurisdictions across the country. And after several years, after they've gained that knowledge, they will begin to do the provisioning and the tax planning for the company, and they have a real solid skill set. But what we're doing now with this kind of outsourcing is we're literally knocking out these bottom rungs in all industries, information technology, even construction. So those are things we have to be really mindful of moving forward. According to KPMG's LinkedIn profile, the company has over 10,000 employees in India. Cognizant's LinkedIn page states it has 150,000 India-based employees. Wikipedia states that IBM has 150,000 employees in India. And according to Reuters, Accenture has 140,000 Indian-based employees. Recently, Disney, SoCal Edison, Qualcomm, Cisco, Cargill, Bank of America, Verizon, Harley-Davidson, Pfizer, Best Buy have all outsourced their entire IT groups. This is happening across the country, and it's not just the large companies, because what happens with this, to get that competitive advantage, medium and small businesses are now looking for ways to outsource their 1 or 2 or 3 IT people. We built an H-1B visa database 2 years ago, and the woman who did the back end, the SQL developer, was Dina Moore. And she was working at Disney when she was called in and told not only was she going to be fired, when she was brought into that office, she thought she was going to be promoted. She had been with them for 12 years, and she was doing great. And they told her not only was she going to be fired, she had to train her replacement. Okay. Good for them. God bless them. Well, Dina did our databases. She has 12 Microsoft certifications. She always undersells, over-delivers. These are the kind of people that are getting whacked. And this is why Americans are apprehensive with information technology. So, I know, Ray, you want me to hurry up, so I'm trying to figure out what can I do? What can I share that will be pertinent? Because I do want to get to the good news. Seriously, I'm not really Okay. All right. So now I have to talk about education in this country as well, because if you want to talk about STEM, as we mentioned earlier, you have to look at education and not just industry. Hilary Gammon, her book, Billions Lost, America's Last Great Resource, our higher education system made up of the best colleges and universities in the world, has turned their education programs into an international export, providing education in stunning numbers to foreign students. In total, over 1 million foreign students were educated in the U.S. higher education system in the 2016-2017 year, a 100% increase from 2004. Now, all of this adds to the cost of college, because universities, University of Chicago, Illinois is probably the greatest offender. They are anxious to get foreign students in because they charge them full freight, but they're also forcing up tuitions and also blocking American students from having a go at those slots. And another thing I'd like to talk about before I'm on college educations. We're still, okay. And this is important because in 2017, consumer advocate Jennifer McDermott wrote, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's labor market for recent college graduates, 43.7% of recent graduates, those ages 22 through 27, with a bachelor's degree or higher, were underemployed, which means they're working in jobs that don't require their degrees. Worse still, the report found that 34.4% of all college graduates are underemployed. If 34.4% of the total student loan debt is not contributing to a relevant job, that means $462 billion in student loan debt is potentially repaid by people in jobs that don't require the degree that costs them so much to earn. Okay, and I will go ahead and now let's talk about the good news. And the reason I talked about what's going on in industry and what's going on in our education system is that this is why Americans are apprehensive about pursuing IT careers. Following the Google walkout a couple weeks ago on sexual harassment, I did a podcast with 4 women in technology. Between the 4 of them, they had 90 years experience in technology. And it was only a couple minutes into this talk on sexual harassment that they began to talk about the employment visa programs and what's going on in terms of culture in these companies and how they as women find themselves less and less desirous of a tech job because they just find, one, it's more difficult to get a job that pays well, and frankly, the cultures are changing. So, the cures, everyone. I'll get to that, and I'll be brief, Ray. 2 more minutes. 2 minutes.
No, 1 minute I give you.
Okay. The cure to this, and how we can create a bright future for information technology and, frankly, all jobs in the United States. Enforce EEOC across the boards, no exception. For too long, Silicon Valley has been given a pass on this, as well as foreign-based outsourcing firms. Right now, there's a trial going on in Oakland, California with, it's called Buchanan versus Tata Consultancy Services, and it is about workplace discrimination, ageism, sexism. So I really strongly urge everyone to follow that trial, and that will give you plenty of examples of what I'm talking about. In fact, there are 1,000 people that have joined that class action suit against Tata. Okay, bring technology, jobs, and data back to U.S. shores. Australia has done this. Europe did it. They pulled it from the GDP, but they will probably get it again. Diversify U.S. employment visa programs so that 1 or 2 countries do not dominate them. Stimulate investment here in the U.S. and not abroad. And real briefly on that, Charlie Munger aptly stated that people tend to do what they're incented to do. In the technology sector alone, there are U.S.-based corporations who, through foundations and investment, have pumped billions of dollars to foreign lands in an effort to improve foreign technology labor forces. If those same U.S.-based companies and foundations were making the same educational and capital investments within the U.S., the positive economic impact within our country would be substantial, and American workers, as well as American population, would benefit. And I will close with that, because I feel a hook coming in.
All right. Kevin, thank you so much. I'm so sorry to cut you short. Maybe I close this up.